It looked like one of those decisions that worked on paper, but the government's decision to target agricultural assets with inheritance tax in last month's budget has certainly got the farmers up in arms and is backfiring on the government. Just to remind you, farms valued at over £1 million, which is to say almost every farm actually across the UK, will now be hit with an effective 20% inheritance tax, whereas before they were exempt. The majority of farms are passed down through generations in order to preserve the nation's agricultural industry, which is why this has caused such controversy. We're expecting a pretty big rally next week. There's also going to be a mass lobby of particularly Labour MPs in Parliament. That's been organised by the National Farmers Union. Before we get to the farmers' position on this, Gordon, we were talking about this in our editorial meeting this morning, and I was saying that one of the most comprehensive arguments for the case about why the government had done this was done by Rachel Reeves when she appeared on BBC's Sunday with Laura Koonsberg 2 weekends ago. Let's hear what she says about why the government is doing this.
Well, let me say this to Rebecca. Let me set out what we did. The £1 million allowance that a couple has before agricultural property relief will exist for her family. In addition to that, the individual claim for agricultural property relief is £1 million now. But if the farm is owned by two people, then of course you could then transfer that allowance to the other person. So you can pass on without paying any tax for most cases, a farm worth £3 million. After that, the tax rate for inheritance tax for agricultural property is 20% compared to 40% that everyone else pays. And you can pay that over a 10-year period interest-free.
But for a family like that, Rebecca, that would be about £100,000 a year that they don't feel they'll have. So what are you saying to her? Suck it up?
Well, what I'm saying is that last year, only a very small number of farms would have been paying any additional inheritance tax. I hope that Rebecca and her family will look through the details, because if the farm is owned by two people, you have £3 million essentially tax-free, and then the tax rate is a 50% discount on everyone else, and you would have 10 years to pay it. So only a very small number of agricultural properties will be affected. But last year, the benefits of agricultural property relief, 40% of the benefit was felt by 7% of the wealthiest landowners. I don't think that it is affordable to carry on with a relief like that when our public services are under so much pressure.
Well, our next guest is one of those who is organising protests against the government's new policies. He is Clive Bailey. He's an arable farmer from Staffordshire who also runs the Farming Forum online, which has more than 40,000 members. And we started by asking him to tell us about his own farm.
So my grandfather started the farm back just after the end of the Second World War. He was a tenant farmer. I think he started with about 8 acres, totally, that he rented. That was a period, obviously, where, still under rationing, issues like food security were very much in the front of people's minds. They were still under rationing for several years after the war, I believe. So he built up that business. He grew it. He kind of worked hard, took risk, borrowed money. Through times far better than I've farmed through, when actually there was a reasonable return in farming, there was less import competition. So he was able to kind of expand that business. He was able to ultimately buy the land that he was a tenant on, and then add to that as other local kind of, as land came up locally, expand them out. He was a dairy farmer, so the amount of cows that he could milk, invested in that, worked hard, made lots of personal sacrifices, did not live like any kind of king, not a rich, wealthy man kind of thing. And he did that all his life until my father took over, which would be towards the end of the 60s, I suppose, kind of late 60s. And he continued the same kind of pattern, continued to add to the foundations that my grandfather had built up. I came along, I suppose. My grandfather died when I was relatively young. But I suppose even though he hadn't done particularly wonderfully out of farming, what he'd done is he'd built something that I'm sure, at least he died knowing that he was leaving that to his son, grandson, and grandchildren. I've got now those great grandchildren, I suppose, now that I've got that weren't around then, obviously. So my father continued the same kind of pattern, carried carried building the farm up, adding more acres to it, reinvesting, any kind of spare profits he didn't need to live off. Not living any kind of extravagant multi-millionaire kind of lifestyle like everyone thinks these wealthy farmers must be. When I was growing up through it, it was a dairy farm. That all came to an end with things like the foot and mouth crisis, kind of put a stop to that. So we kind of, like all businesses, we adapted to those changes. We became more the arable farm that I've taken on when I came back from university, continued to build up, continued to take risk, work hard, I'd like to think anyway, invest, borrow money, fighting the weather, politics, and increasingly difficult situations with trade deals and things that aren't against us, to build up to where we are today. Now, I've got two children, William and Henry. They're quite young still. They're 12 and 13. So 11 and 13. Sorry, I should know that. Now I'm at a stage where you think, well, if they want the option of going into that family farm and continuing that and building it further, I'm not sure that's available for them. My father's in his kind of late 70s, doesn't enjoy the best of health. It's not like we've ignored this subject. We've done lots of succession planning and stuff over the years to try and make sure that things are safe. But of course, a major part of that succession planning was the APR and BPR reliefs that were available. So it's not like we've had our head in the sand or ignored this. But it's very difficult when you've had no notice or time to plan for it to suddenly completely reform and remake your plans. 7-year gifting, for instance, I'd like to think he's got 7 years, but who knows? Who knows if any of us have?
So the reliefs that you mentioned there, APR reliefs, they are those inheritance tax reliefs, aren't they? That until now, agricultural land could be passed on free of inheritance tax. Does the farm technically still belong to your father, or are you the owner of the farm?
So we're a partnership, like most farms are. The limited kind of company structure that most people have been more familiar with doesn't suit farming for various reasons. I'm not an accountant, I'm a farmer, but I've always been a part of the family partnership. So I am a partner, so I do own a proportion of the business, but predominantly the agricultural assets and the farm business is predominantly my mother and father's name, which so with APR, agricultural property relief, and business property relief. Now that's a key point here. Everyone's talking about the APR loss in the budget, but as a trading family farm business, our planning wasn't based and completely reliant on agricultural property relief. We're a trading active farming business. So we also would have been using business property relief, BPR, something that's not exclusive to farmers, something that all businesses have access to, all family businesses have access to. And that would have been, a big part of our tax planning as well. So it's not just the APR, it's the BPR. And I'm very aware here that farmers have got, we've kind of managed to kind of steal the headlines a little bit because of the APR thing in the countryside. But this is something that's affecting all small and medium-sized businesses. I was talking to a guy the other day, a family, undertakers, similar thing, third generation business. They're very invested, adding different, more funeral parlours and whatever. And he was saying, it's late now. The older partners within the business are elderly. So when they pass away, they're probably the only way they're going to be able to kind of fill that tax bill is probably to sell off one or two of their parlours. So it's not just about farmers. We're not special. I don't like that inference. I always believe that, this whole farmers are special. No one, in my mind, everyone plays their part in society. Nurses are special, doctors are special, firemen are special. Everyone plays their part in society. Well, possibly with the exception of politicians. We could probably do without a few less of them. But we're not special, but there is something different about farming as a business. And that is the fact that the returns on that capital invested are so marginal. We're talking like a 1% return on investment. This £1 million figure that's been banded around of relief, and that protects the 73% of farms wouldn't be affected. It's utter nonsense. Those figures are based not on viable farming businesses. Those sub £1 million assets, they're exactly the kind of people that have been using APR to avoid their taxes. They're people who have other income or have made their money elsewhere. They bought a nice little rural property of a bit of land, and all of a sudden it qualifies for APR. Great. They're not family farms. At best, they're a small holding who's got a day job and maybe farms at the weekend. A viable family farm these days, you're talking probably a minimum of £3 or £4 million worth of assets. An arable farm like ours, 750 acres or so of owned land. In this area, that's 10, 12, 13 million pounds. But the returns on that would be 1%. So, you're looking at kind of perhaps £100,000 a year pre-tax worth of income from that. Take the tax away from there, you're down to what, 70, 80,000 pounds. Divided by 2 generations, 2 families, you're down to that 30,000 pounds or so against all that capital employed. You're down to, no one's making fortunes out of farming. You are, probably, unless you're a really big farm, you are probably, no better income than the national minimum wage.
Clive, can I put to you one of the points that Rachel Reeves makes alongside that point that she says, she describes at least part of this as a loophole. Wealthy people are buying large farms to avoid inheritance tax, which I think you've dealt with in that answer. The other point that she makes is that the government also announced a lot of support for the farming sector in the budget, with subsidies and other mechanisms that they are using. Is that right? Or do you feel that it's not only on APR and BPR that you have a problem, but actually the support has never been there really since the UK left the European Union?
Well, she's a politician, isn't she? She's bound to try and put a positive spin on things. And no, there was, the APR and BPR issues of what's dominated the headlines here, because they're massive. They spell the end of the family farm, even though they've claimed that 73% won't be affected. As I just covered, that figure's nonsense. And agricultural economists could kind of put the figures behind that to show that. I'm sure they've looked at the data from HMRC. What they've not done is look at what the situations behind that data. It's no good just looking at the numbers. You've got to understand where those numbers come from. So there was a lot of other things in there that in the budget that, again, individually are massive. They announced a carbon tax, which I think comes in from 2029. That will affect the price of fertilizers for farmers in the UK massively. However, they didn't put a carbon tax on imported food. So yet again, that's another nail in British agriculture, because we become yet less competitive with our import competition. We're already, because of some absolutely terrible trade deals done, we're already at import, it's difficult to kind of compete with imports. Imported food that's come to this country is produced at much lower environmental and welfare standards than the UK. Now, British farmers we're proud that our standards are higher, but we have to be able to compete. Otherwise, our prices are set by those imports. And that's why, I talk about that very low return on investment. That's not farmers' fault. That's not because we're inefficient or really bad at it. UK farmers are amongst some of the most efficient and best in the world, believe it or not. We lead on this kind of stuff. However, we're price takers. We can't set our prices because the prices are dictated by those imports. And also obviously huge influence from supermarkets that are making massive profits at the moment. I mean, Tesco's 2.9 billion last year, so like 2.6 or 2.7 the year before. If you want to take more money out of the food chain, I think you're looking in the wrong place. Look at the people that've actually got a big return on investment. Farmers simply can't pay that 20% tax once a generation to basically be rebuying 20% of your business once a generation when you've got a 1% return on investment is impossible.
So in what very little spare time I imagine you have, Clive, you run the Farming Forum. Tell us a little bit about that. What is it and what are its aims?
It's been going about, I think we started in about 2009, 2010. I was going for a period at that time where we were making big changes to the way that we farmed. Obviously agriculture's always been heavily dependent on European subsidies, and I could see that wasn't sustainable. I could see that ultimately, as farmers, we've got to stand on our own 2 feet more, just being paid to own land is wrong. I've always said that. So I've never been a great fan of agricultural subsidies. So we were looking. Personally, we were looking at changing the way that we farm, trying to increase our efficiency, trying to innovate, improve our yields, reduce our fixed costs, like any good business would do. And I travelled a bit and visited farmers in other countries. And one thing I came across was a lot of them, particularly in where climate was a bit more unpredictable, either like heavier rainfalls or droughttier kind of areas. They had this no tillage thing in common. They were all, and what I came away thinking, actually, that saves a lot of money. If we don't put lots of money into fuel and high horsepower tractors and labour, we can reduce our fixed costs. These guys in countries, kind of New Zealand, Australia, South America, and some parts of Europe, I learned a lot from them, and came back home basically thinking, right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go down this route. I was by no means the first farmer in the UK. There was others that I kind of networked with and found that were doing it, but it was quite niche. This whole, what's now become known as regenerative farming, regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture. And it has this fantastic advantage that I didn't realise that it's obvious at the time, but obviously what we're doing using more non-cash crops and cover crops, we're capturing carbon. So we're kind of putting some of those, it's environmentally really good from an improved water, air quality, having more wildlife, less monocultures without getting too far down the rabbit hole. But anyway, I started the forum because I was trying to learn from other farmers' mistakes, and there was nothing else like it at the time. So I kind of came to the conclusion, this small network of farmers that I'd kind of come across, if we could keep in touch, if we could share each other's successes and failures and mistakes, that would maybe save me money, quite selfishly. So it's quite a selfish reason to start it in that first place. And particularly when obviously some of these farmers were in other countries, or even in the UK, there were, a really good guy I learned a lot from in Kent, another chap in Scotland. So the internet was just getting useful back then. We'd gone past dial-up. We actually could share photos or small videos or whatever. So I started the forum purely to be able to kind of network with this small group of farmers that were innovating and trying these new techniques. But what happened was it filled a space because there was nothing else like it. The people using it started talking about, problem with a sheep, or what tractor should I buy, or the rights and wrongs of agricultural politics, all sorts of things. So it very quickly became a much more general forum. Caught me out a little bit at that time. I had to kind of invest a bit of money because the whole thing started for with $100 kind of license fee for the platform that did it. But very quickly it went quite viral just because there was nothing like it at the time. And today it's become a bit of a monster, really, where we have kind of 40,000 unique visitors every single day, talking about absolutely anything, about farming, basically, and a load of other nonsense, quite honestly. But it's really useful, though. And I mean, there's been some lovely stories. In fact, we've had people, meet each other and get married off it. There's a very depressing thread on there about suicide and depression, which I'm sure you may know is, mental health in agriculture is a big issue. You've got isolated people, up against it financially, feeling unappreciated by politicians and society and whatever reasons. But the suicide rate, very sadly, in this industry is shocking. And depression's a big issue. And there's a long running thread on there. Obviously, it's almost like self-help. The farmers are kind of talking to each other, kind of literally in some cases talking each other back off the edge. So I'm sure it's kind of helped some people a lot in that respect. It helps us innovate and share ideas, become better farmers. There's farmers from overseas on there, so we're all doing the same thing, but obviously in different ways, so we can learn from the efficiency of techniques in other countries. It's a hell of a thing. I never expected it, and you wouldn't think. I've got friends outside of farming that find it hilarious that all these farmers, so many of them are using the internet in this way. But actually, when you think about it, it's perfect for people who tend to live in, often quite isolated, working on their own. These days, the technology in farming, you can be sitting on a tractor with automatic steering and stuff. So you're on your smartphone, you've got the forum in your pocket, or you can be milking your cows and waiting between, each cow being milked. It's perfect when you think about it.
Okay, and you're organising a protest, I think, aren't you, through the farming forum?
Yeah, so it's not directly through the farming forum, but obviously, a website like that gives a great place for people to be able to share their ideas and organise themselves. So the background to the rally, I'd rather not call it a protest. The Met Police don't seem to like that word when we're talking to them. What was going on, the background there was that obviously when all this was announced, there was considerable anger by farmers. The forum and Twitter suddenly became dominated by very little other than farmers, saying, what we're going to do. This is the end of my family farm. I don't know what to do here. Some desperate people, some really sad stories. I mean, there's been, I think the paper's reported one suicide already. I'm not sure it's the last. I very much hope it is, but that's the level of pressure it's putting on these people, which I think is utterly terrible. So it became quite apparent quite quickly that something needed to be done. The NFU announced that they were going to hold what they call a mass lobby in London. So that's what they've organised. It started off being 600 people in Church Hall at Westminster. They're encouraging people to get their MPs, there to talk to, and mass lobby. That very quickly sold out to NFU members. Now, not all farmers are NFU members, so straight away the non-NFU members were like, well, where can we have how do we get our voices heard? I'm coming to London anyway. We're getting that. The NFU thing filled out very quickly, and then they extended it to 3 sessions. So they have 1,800 NFU members going there for their mass lobby. But then I think it was Thursday, they said, we're not going to be organising anything beyond that. No other rally or march or demonstration or protest or whatever you want to call it. Myself and a few other farmers, Ollie Harrison, who has a large YouTube following, Andrew Ward, another arable farmer, again with a large YouTube following, Martin Williams, and a guy called James Mills. We all kind of know each other. We'd all been chatting in a WhatsApp group and said, look, we were all getting, as kind of those higher profile social media kind of farmers, we were getting message after message after message saying, what are we going to do? What are you going to organise? Where? Just tell me where, when, how, what. We're behind it, kind of thing. Now, we were nervous about this because with this government and the kind of the laws that they have to stop some of these things being organised, the last thing any of us want to do is get involved in anything that involves disruption or causes problems that could get any of us arrested, quite frankly. That's not going to help. That's not going to help my family. That's going to add to my family's problems, isn't it? So we were very aware of making sure that we did things properly. We also felt that we have a lot of public support on this issue, and although there are harder core, more militant groups of farmers saying we need to get more like the European farmers, more like the French, burn tyres in the street, blockade roads, cause chaos, all of these other kind of ideas. We kind of felt that, actually, in the first instance, we've got this public support. Let's not, cause problems. The moment someone can't get an ambulance to hospital and, you lose public support. So we didn't want to go down that route. All we wanted to do is give all those farmers that can't go to that NFU event somewhere that's more organised, where they can get together, have some speakers, maybe some politicians, maybe some celebrities that have said that that have offered support, and make that a bit more organised event. So we spoke to the Met Police to tell them, surely it's better that there's something organised rather than just all these other farmers randomly turning up, and they were on board with that. They've been really helpful with that. The plans at the moment are quite loose because we're trying to get a grasp on, are we talking 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? We need to get some kind of grasp on numbers, which is what we've been doing. We put a registration form up online, and we're encouraging everyone who's going to go just to let us know, so we get some kind of numbers to ensure their safety. It's not a drive tractors through London. It's not a cause trouble. It's not inconvenience. It's just a rally that will end in Parliament Square. That bit I do know, and to complement that NFU event. That's our plan.
So I was just going to say, how many people are you expecting as things stand, and will one of them be Jeremy Clarkson? Yeah, be careful to say it. Basically, we have a lot. There's 4,000 odd registered in the first kind of 24 hours or so online. I think a lot that are planning to come haven't registered. There's a big farming show at the NEC every year, which I think it's about 40 or 50,000 people. And it feels to me every farmer, everyone I speak to, not everyone goes to that farming event, but everyone I speak to is saying, I'm definitely coming to London. So I think 10,000 is an easily achievable number. We're still, 10 days away, aren't we? Something like that. So easily achievable. But it could be a lot more. And I think also what we're trying to get across now is this isn't just about farmers. Although this affects the countryside and these family businesses, family farms, it affects all family farms. So I think really what we might see in this next week is maybe more of these other just family businesses. I mean, the hospitality industry is up in arms about some of these changes as well. It doesn't have to just be about farming, although obviously that's a key message, because
farming is not just farming, it's our countryside, isn't it? What happens to our countryside if farmers aren't farming it? If it gets bored, if no one's going to invest in farming and growing food because it's just too marginal, and there's no tax reasons either to do that or whatever, or no succession, who's going to own it? And my bet is a bit like what's happened in America, with Microsoft buying huge areas of farmland. They will buy this land, but not to farm it. They'll buy it for kind of like, carbon offset and potential development and solar and all those kind of things that most people don't want in the British countryside. It will change the shape of this country forever if this isn't sorted.
And Jeremy Clarkson, you were quite careful not to say whether he's coming or not. Are you in touch with him?
We're in touch. We are in touch. We're speaking, but we can neither confirm or deny whether he will be part of this at this stage. But he's certainly very supportive, let's say.
As you've said, Clive, it's not just the farms themselves, it's other family businesses, but also all the supply chain to the farms. So the people that provide a lot of the kit that you use and do a lot of the building, and lots of farmers saying they're no longer going to do capital investment because that means that could increase the value of their land, which means there's even greater impact from inheritance tax. Given all those things, Clive, do you think the Labour government understands farming?
No, not at all. It's obvious. And the giveaway that they don't understand farming is that £1 million relief. They clearly have no idea of the amount of capital investment that is required to sustain a viable family farm. A combine harvester today is a £500,000 plus piece of equipment. An average size tractor is a £250,000, and you normally need, even a relatively small farm will have more than one tractor. You can spend £1 million in a milking parlour, grain storage and whatever, can be £500,000, £600,000 type buildings. It's really, really expensive, and that's why although I totally get. When people say, £1 million relief, that's loads, or hey, if you've got 500 acres of land, that's perhaps £10 million worth of asset. You're wealthy. Surely you can afford to pay your tax. And that's exactly right. The day that if we ever had to sell it up, we would pay our taxes. We'd pay our capital gains on that, like any other business. Farming is not special in that respect. We'd pay our capital gains tax on that, and that would be the end of our farming. The difference with farming is you've got that huge amounts of capital, but that return on that investment is tiny. So we don't do it for that reason. Farmers, they're not doing it for the money. It's a vocational, multi-generational thing. There's that ability to pass on to that next generation that as long as we're okay, as long as we can kind of like make enough to put food on the table and afford a reasonable kind of lifestyle. And frankly, it's been so tight in recent years. No end of farmers are kind of saying, actually, even before this, do you know what? It's just too tight. With all that money invested, we do have a choice. You could cash in, you could pay the capital gains on that, and you could live happily ever after as a pretty wealthy person in most cases. But most farmers I know, you wouldn't think they were wealthy at all, because that money isn't money. It's acres or it's cattle. They don't talk in pounds, shilling and pence. They talk in how many acres you farm, or how many cattle have you got, or how many sheep have you got. Because until the day it's sold, it isn't actually money. And if it's passed to you, you have an obligation, or always feel obliged to pass that opportunity to that next generation. The only reason farms get sold, in my experience, is for two reasons. Either they're in financial difficulty, or there is no next generation wanting to follow on. At which point, they get sold. The owner realises all of that capital that's been built up by those previous generations. They pay their tax on that, but that's it. They're not a farmer anymore. Somebody else is.
Rachel Reeves, thanks, Clive. Rachel Reeves is digging in. They've said there'll be no U-turns. Do you imagine, given that you may need to ratchet up, I hear what you're saying completely. We hear what you're saying completely about you don't want to kind of just stop oil, bringing cities to a standstill, or motorway networks to a standstill. I really hear that from you, Clive. But if you need to up the level of protest, given the government has said there will be no U-turn, can you imagine something like a farmers' strike, or what the next stage could be? Or are you step by step, let's get through the is it demonstration or protest? I can't remember, Clive, which is the best way.
I think
rally. Sorry, rally. We're describing it. Thank you, Gordon. The rally, and then are you thinking about what next? Could there be a strike ultimately?
Without doubt, there's no doubt about that. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the last week or so effectively trying to calm down a lot of farmers that really do already want to be a lot more militant about this. And I think of all demographics, if this government wants to pick a fight, they're picking it with the wrong bunch of people. You think about the logistics, any other industry that has the logistics that UK farmers do, they're literally everywhere. They have large equipment and ability to cause no end of problems and disruption. Now, I really do not want it to go down that route, but I'm pretty confident, and I'm not going to risk myself going to prison for kind of organising such things or suggesting such things. But I think, from what I'm hearing, it's pretty likely that if there isn't at least, they don't start talking to and getting these numbers right. I don't think we actually really want a complete U-turn. I think farmers understand this. We understand they have this hole in the budget. We need better public service. I want a better NHS. I want better roads. I'm sick to death of the potholes and poor policing in the rural areas and whatever. So totally behind the need for them to raise more money. But there's got to be better ways to do that than trying to destroy the family farm and take the countryside and rural economy with it. That's not smart. Ultimately, it will collect you less money. They're already talking in all of their mitigation about this. They're saying, well, farmers can plan ahead and they can change their wills and they can use their £1 million. There's various snags behind that, which we could discuss if you'd like to, as to why it doesn't work. But they can do all these things to mitigate, then it won't affect them. Well, what's the point in putting a tax in place and then telling everybody how to oh, don't worry, you won't have to pay it anyway? That's a bit pointless. If you genuinely want to raise more money, they need to find a tax that genuinely does raise more money, surely. So I don't understand it. I don't understand that logic. And I think it's fair to say, as we mentioned in the first, the first question you asked me, there's been abuse of APR at both ends. At the bottom, that kind of, the million, those kind of people that have made their money, fair enough, they made their money in other businesses or retired and bought a place in the country with a bit of land with it. Suddenly they qualify for APR. And that's a lot of that 73% of claimants that Rachel Reeves says won't be affected because they put that threshold in. They really need to look at those numbers. And then at the top end of the scale, we've got some huge institutional type buyers that have bought hundreds of millions of pounds worth of farmland. And again, I'm sure part of that reason is because it's got that tax efficiency. That needs to be stopped. That's not family farms. But what I'd like to see two things, two clear kind of asks to Rachel Reeves, if you happen to listen to this, is they need to look at that threshold. If they got that threshold right, if they properly reflected the level of investment that is needed in a viable family farm, and it's a £5-10 million figure, not 1 million. It's significantly higher than where it is. If they got that right, or did a better, or had a better means of testing, are you actually a genuine farmer or just somebody? I know those kind of things are complicated to assess, but if you had a better test in there to make sure that genuinely this relief was only being offered to the right people. That's the first thing that needs to be arrested. Then I think to leave it in place for those that are trying to use farmland and agricultural business as a tax evasion tool or tax avoidance tool, that's fair enough. That needs doing. That would actually be good for farmers, as she's tried to, as I said, to some extent. By taking that away, maybe you do actually help agriculture. So that's not wrong. The other thing that I'd like to see changed is, obviously, this has come very late. Now, the average age, I think it's 38% of farmers in the UK are over the age of 67. Now, that says two things to you. One, if these guys are all so wealthy, why are they still working? Why haven't they bothered retiring? I think that compares to 4% of the general population over 67 that's still working. But what it also, it's wrong to assume that they've not been considering succession or not doing any tax planning. They have been, but a big part of that advice has been, well, you've got APR and BPR, so there's your plan. Just suddenly move the goalposts on such an old generation. They've not got time to plan now. If they were to gift to previous generations, that's fine. If the older generation is in their 40s, 50s, even their 60s now, 7-year gifting periods is enough for them to kind of take advice, get things in place, pass it down sooner than maybe they had planned to the next generation, which is maybe advantageous to give that next generation, more skin in the game in the business or whatever. That's great. I encourage that totally. But when you've got 80-year-old farmers or older, they've not got time. The odds are they're not going to get 7 years to be able to gift. So the other thing I'd like changed on this, not U-turn, just kind of a more sensible way of looking at it is all those farmers that are over, say, retirement age, over 67, just give them a temporary, say reduce the 7 years to 2 years or something like that, just to give them time to plan, to make sure that the next generation is correct. Because that older generation right now, I've never seen my own father so upset about something, so depressed. They feel guilty. They feel that they've messed this up now for their next generation. I should have done something. Truth is, they haven't. They've done the right thing based on the circumstance and the advice at that time. But the goalposts have been moved on them at a point in the game, literally at 89 minutes of a 90-minute football match. They haven't got time to think about it now.
Clive, thank you so much for giving us all that information on how farmers are feeling across the UK and, as you say, other small businesses. I'm assuming you'll be in London next week, and we may well be able to catch up with you there. But thanks so much for joining the Daily Tea.